Thank you, and welcome back to Governance Week 2026. Thank you, day 5, as we look at the governance of groups and conglomerates on our wider theme of governance in a volatile world. We had a really excellent presentation this morning from Robert Riley, followed by quite a fascinating conversation in panel 1 this morning that looked at governance at scale, oversight across complex group structures. We had Sharice Ammon joining us from Cayman Islands, Derek Rajak joining us from Jamaica, Saudia Passad joining from Guyana, and our moderator was our own director, Elizabeth Cox from Guyana. We move now to panel 2, and this panel will be looking at risk and strategy, governing for long-term value creation. We have Alasdair Roe from Belize, Barry Collymore from Grenada, and Sacha Vacciana Riley from Jamaica, who will make up this panel, and our moderator, another of our directors at CCGI. So I would like to ask Quentrell. Very good. So we have brought Carmel up on the screen. Carmel, you look lovely. I love the new hairstyle.
Thank you, Kamala, and thank you
So
as well to the panelists and everybody for joining us this afternoon.
thank you. So I'm going to introduce you briefly now, Carmel, and then you will take over introducing your panelists and the session. So Carmel Haynes is Executive Director at the Barbados International Business Association, which is the Association for Global Business in Barbados. BIBA represents over 140 member firms involved in international financial services, trade and logistics, management, and corporate services. As the executive director of BIBA, she supports the president and board in delivering on its mission in the interest of its members and the economic development of Barbados. And in this role, she also sits on the board of directors of the Barbados Private Sector Association, and by extension, the Full Social Partnership, a tripartite participatory governance body chaired by the Prime Minister. So she does quite a bit of work in Barbados. She's been a member of CCGI for many years, and we are so proud to have her as a director as well. And Carmel has been involved, I think, in almost all of our Governance Week so far. So we are very pleased to have her here. And Carmel, I handed over the session to you now in your very capable hands.
Thank you again, Kamala. So happy to be here this afternoon and appreciative as well for all of the participants who have still turned out on a Friday afternoon. I know in some cases, Friday after work lines are calling, but thank you for being, willing to join us for this conversation on the intersection of risk governance and long-term value creation. So with that being said, I am going to briefly introduce our panelists. I believe, Kamala, each of you with the agenda, all of the participants would have the full bios for the panelists. So I will just make some brief introductions, and then I will ask each panelist to make their opening remarks, which should be no longer than 7 minutes each. And then we will move into the actual discussion, where I will pose some questions that I have previously shared with the panelists, and of course, they can come with their own insights as well. So first off, I will introduce Barry Collymore, who is a director of Republic Bank Limited, but he's also the owner and chairman of the award-winning luxury boutique hotel, Monk Cinnamon Beach Resort, boutique hotel, Monk Cinnamon Beach Resort, Grenada. He's also a co-founder of the West Indies School of Hospitality, which is a new hospitality school developed in collaboration with Cornell. And WISH offers over 5,000 hospitality scholarships annually. Additionally, Barry is a member of the board of directors of the Republic Bank of Grenada. So welcome, Barry.
Thank you.
Next, I would like to introduce Sacha Vacciana Riley, who was appointed as the executive director of the Private Sector Organization of Jamaica, or PSOJ, in September 2023. She has garnered over 15 years of rich professional experience in various sectors, including international trade, the private legal bar, and finance, including 10 years at the senior management level. She has a strong background in delivering sustainable and effective results in regulatory compliance, risk management, strategic management, and the implementation of compliance and corporate governance systems. Welcome, Sacha.
Thanks, Carmel. Good afternoon.
Thank you. And then last but not least, I'd like to introduce Alasdair Roe, who is the director of GA Roe and Sons in Belize. Alasdair is the product of the global insurance and reinsurance industries. Today, he serves as a director on the board of GA Roe and Sons Limited, a family-owned business in Belize with over 60 years of operations, starting with and continuing in insurance through 3 licensed insurance companies operating in Belize, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent. Welcome, Alasdair.
Carmel. Thank you, everybody.
Great. And so with that being said, I'm now going to ask you to deliver your introductory remarks. I'll start in reverse. So Alasdair, you can unmute again and offer some brief introductory remarks.
Great. Well, thank you very much again, Carmel. Thank you, Kamla. I really appreciate the team. And it's such a privilege, really, to be a continuing sponsor, I guess, and supporter of this program. I've enjoyed many of the sessions this week, and actually I wanted to spend my 7 minutes sort of touching on the elements because I'm surrounded by other choir members. We're all in the same boat, and I've really enjoyed a lot of the speeches, and I've continued to sort of develop over the many years that we've been associated with you. And I do think it's like a 4,000 level school course for directors. So just to set the scene, by the way, we got the World Cup going on next door. It is Friday afternoon. I see we've got like 4 pages of individuals attending this. So I applaud you guys all. And also to mention too that although I was born in Belize, I'm sitting today in Tallahassee in Florida, and we're on the eve of a 250th independence celebration. So yeah, I think that's perfect context, right? Because while it may not be perfect in any one of our businesses, we still have to persevere and aspire to grow. So let me start by, I'll start and finish by sharing elements of my development this week. Some of the things I've heard that resonates with what we're doing at GA Roe & Sons and with what I'm doing personally. I think firstly, given the context of where we sit today, Friday afternoon around the world and beautiful parts of certainly the world, it's mindset that is really important to the individuals that are participating on boards or around boards. We need to be resilient. We need to be long-term committed. It was Dr. Sharp said earlier this week, and I do want to give props to as many people as possible. And I'm sorry if I miss you, but she brought a technical term to this, right? Like thermodynamics, the science of thermodynamics, and the importance of not letting entropy take over any of these companies. We have to keep them busy. We have an obligation to continuously develop, and that's what we're all doing here today. Kamla, you offered that in a number of sessions, and I really appreciate that. We talked about the importance of health. Wealth starts with health. It's a famous coinage, and as we spend so much time in the insurance industry within GA Roe & Sons, that is so true. So, maintaining and supporting our own health. And then lastly, it's not easy being a director. Listening to Mr. Riley earlier today, it was just really refreshing. Again, we're all in the same boat. We're all learning. And I think it was Marlon Yard said earlier in the week that as directors, what we try to do is identify as early as possible the issues that are in our organization so that we can correct them and that we can limit, mitigate, even hopefully remove these issues. As I think we all sit in very healthy, successful, vibrant companies. I think what's been important too is the period of time. Dr. Mintzberg at the outset said that the pressures of life put periods of time, at least, around both the executive and non-executive elements of these companies into periods of years, possibly even quarters. He brought on the political concerns that we all live under, and so maybe you're looking at a 4 or 5 year political period. And really just even the catastrophes of last week in Venezuela remind all of us that we should be looking at timeframes of centuries. Venezuela itself had been hit last by a 7+ Richter scale earthquake at the beginning of the century. You look at COVID and what COVID did, and it was about 100 years difference between the Spanish flu and COVID. So it really suggests that we need to broaden the time periods with which we look at. And me being a part of a family business and a family firm that's now a conglomerate, it's the horizon for us is as long as many people can see. We're limited by our own age and mortality, but we want these businesses to be successful for much longer than that. So just to keep time periods in perspective. Before I get to culture, I think culture is probably the most important thing. I did, and kind of keeping in theme of time, what's happening around us is very concerning, right? You've got geopolitical concerns. And so I just wanted to make a plug because I know we're all students of the world here. And I myself, and I've got great colleagues like Liz Cox, who I think is on this call. We participate in Rotary, which itself is an international organization, and it brings voices like all of ours, disparate individual voices together to make a difference in the world. And it also gives people the opportunity to sit on boards and to have those experiences, because I know everyone here is looking for those experiences. So a plug for Rotary and other organizations, Lions, other local organizations, to supply you with the necessary need of a platform to magnify just those personal voices. Culture. Come back to my colleague Liz Cox. She says it eats everything. I think as a director and even as an executive in companies, you have to be extremely concerned about culture, and therefore you have to be extremely concerned and attentive to people. And we spend a lot of time talking about people. We spend a lot of time preparing for succession, natural and surprise succession. And so, all of our businesses have people at the heart of them. Barry, I looked at your website and you have a beautiful resort. It's beautiful, but I'm sure people have a lot to do with the experience that people take away. And so just to introduce you a little more maybe to G.A. Roe and Sons, is that we are a conglomerate. We were a conglomerate in Belize, within the boundaries of Belize, as we participated in many different industries, starting in insurance and financial services, but expanding into hospitality, into agriculture, into distribution, into real estate. We 3 years ago, and it's hard to believe it's been that long, but we intentionally and in a big way expanded our footprint across the Caribbean, to the Eastern Caribbean, and to St. Lucia and St. Vincent. So we became this multinational conglomerate, and so that's probably what has me sitting on this panel. But we've invested heavily in centralized services. And I know it's got its pros and its cons. We've debated it internally, but it was good again to hear from Mr. Riley this morning and his support of that, given his much elevated status in a much bigger firm, not to mention his experience at BP. But to understand that centralized services, it can't be one size fits all. And it also needs to show value. But what it does allow us to do is to centralize culture. And it was the elements around culture, or at least the centralization, is share. We share one asset. We've got one reputation. So it makes sense to centralize some of these services. And just so you know, we haven't just centralized HR, but we've centralized other elements like compliance, like audit, like internal audit, like human resources, as mentioned before. And probably the other big one is investment. So bringing that back to the core of our business and trying to centralize that. Closing out, to speak about the board, I think the biggest role that the board has is to just break down complexity. We don't park the bus. to fix it. Everybody is we're dealing with many issues. Many of them are surprises, but we can't stop to fix it. We have to fix on the fly. And so our role is to break down complexity, and to do that, you have to communicate, and you have to communicate effectively. So technology is a big issue that we look at, and we have invested in it. I thought we were very wise in the way we did it. We encouraged individuals to play with it outside of the context and the lines, the perimeters of our businesses. And they spent about a year doing that. And then we started to actually, bring some of that technology in. Obviously, we've had chatbots and things like that, but it's continual. We're always looking at advancements in technology, and we have to consider how we can integrate these processes and services into our businesses. I thought it was really interesting. Dr. Mintzberg talked about change in the political, social environment, and even going back to Martin Luther, the period of Martin Luther. And I think there's a lot to be spoken about there. And it comes back to technology, right? Because all of our clients now, with the support and assistance of AI, will become so much more sophisticated in how they shop. And therefore, we need to be aware of that. We need to understand where we're putting our dollars. And just to put a plug for us, we're a bronze sponsor here. And I think from it's a great investment for us, and it really puts our money behind what we say we do, from an environmental, from a personal development perspective. So you've got to be aware of that as people will be looking at the total enterprise and seeing where those investments go. I think the last point I'll touch on is the CEO. There's been a lot of discussion about the interaction between the board and the CEO, and the CEO is the face of the organization. You have to accept that, and they're local. They have to be present. It's very important. We spent a lot of time over the last 2 years through just general succession, looking at replacing the highest levels, whether they're CEOs or managing directors in our firms. And it's taken a long time. I think there's plenty of really incredible applicants and candidates in the region, but you have to find the right fit. And so as the face of the organization, it's absolutely essential, but the work with the board and the work that the board does around that CEO to support them, to ensure they're successful and prepared for success in their environments, are absolutely essential. And that's what we're committed to. So let me stop there, Carmel, and I'll hand it back to you, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Alasdair, for taking us through your experience and applying it to how you view the operations of board, and also really helping us to see that sort of cross-border, the implications for some of the things that you have dealt with. And so with that being said, I would also now invite Sacha to deliver her brief introductory remarks. Sacha, over to you.
Good afternoon, and thanks again, Carmel. Thanks for that, Alasdair. That was very interesting and a different perspective from what I've brought here this afternoon. For those who don't know, the Private Sector Organization of Jamaica, similar to Carmel's entity, we are a business support organization. And so for us, it is about advocacy. It is about supporting the business community. We have over 400 members. And so as you can well imagine, with the cross-cutting nature of our industries, we have a wide remit in terms of the representation of the business community and what we believe is necessary for economic growth. With that said, however, I believe that the question of governance for organizations such as ours, business support organizations, although we certainly have our operations that we run in similar ways to the Roe group, for example, or otherwise in terms of some of the typical areas that we look at in risk. So, the operational risk, cyber risk, all of those things. Of course, those are important. But one of the things that I want to raise here, and I think as a PSOG, as a not-for-profit, as a business support organization, is the importance of looking at institutional relevance. as a membership-based advocacy support organization, one of our greatest long-term risks is often institutional relevance. And I say that in the context of where the PSOJ as an entity, for example, finds itself at this particular juncture. We're in a rapidly changing world. All businesses are experiencing it. The boards and organizations are increasingly, of course, being called upon to not only govern performance and compliance in the way we used to traditionally, but I believe we must now look at some of those intangible assets, institutional relevance. I mentioned trust, for example, influence and impact. As I mentioned, one of our core roles on behalf of our membership is advocacy. And so, of course, in terms of our relations with other stakeholders, government, etc., influence and impact that is really our currency. And so with that said, unlike some of the colleagues here, Alasdair and otherwise, for whom value creation is primarily through assets and, capital market position and that scaling we spoke about earlier, our value creation is really through influence and the convening power that we have, collective trust, and of course, advocacy. So with that said, I believe one of the main challenges that is affecting our sector is the growing risk of institutional relevance. And I mentioned how this is actually particularly close to home for me as a PSOJ leader, in the sense that we this year, just in June, celebrated our 50th year. And what it has meant is that in this changing operating environment in which we exist, the PSOJ created in 1976, for example, is a different PSOJ today, just based on some of the macroeconomic realities that would have existed at the time of formation and what currently exists now. And so, of course, one of the key things that our boards have to consider is how do we remain relevant? Because we're talking about long-term value, we're talking about sustainability, all of those things that are in our title and we've been discussing since morning. And so it becomes a question of, we were created for a particular purpose back in 1970. How do we govern in this new environment that exists, which is a changing operating environment? How do we ensure that we are looking at the things that are important, the risks that are currently facing us, the new risks as governing bodies, right? So we know that currently, and I'm sure Carmel and other business support organizations can refer to this, members have more options for information, networking, and some of the things that originally, we were created for. Of course, they expect immediate results, especially in the times in which we are living now. Digital platforms, AI, all of those things. And these are actually serving, yes, they're positive in many ways, but they're actually serving to disintermediate traditional representation that our organizations are able to offer. So with that said, we also have another factor that that boards will have to look at. We have younger business leaders, and of course, in this day and age, they engage differently than previous generations. So of course, the question is, many of these rising up, and the question is, how is the PSOJ relevant, or how is this business support organization relevant to us today? And of course, public trust in institutions globally is under pressure, and so that also is a challenge for us in terms of our governance. Right? And so, of course, we know that there are implications if we fail to manage those risks, or advocacy loses its influence, our influence is weakened and our relevance becomes under threat. And so what that means is that presents a challenge for our boards to look differently and move beyond just oversight of activities and actually focus on the oversight of relevance. And that is actually what my board is at this point doing upon our 50th anniversary. How has the PSOJ changed? How can we make the PSOJ relevant in terms of what our stakeholders want, both in terms of the government interface and our counterparts, but also in terms of member value? We're talking about long-term value. So are we actually PSOJ as we're constituted today, solving today's problems, or are we still looking at the problems that existed when we were created 50 years ago? Does our value proposition still matter? And so just for a little bit of context, those who may not be aware, in 1976 Jamaica, it looked quite different from a 2026 Jamaica, in terms of the political dynamics at the time, privatization, and the whole reason and ethos behind a PSOJ being created. And so we now have to look at these circumstances have changed. Our value proposition must also change, right? And of course, again, as I said, the stakeholders who we are serving, they too have changed. So is the board listening to this next generation of stakeholders? Are we including, or are we basically serving them stale food, as it were, right? What was relevant, 50 years ago, which is not necessarily now. So I just want to talk about that issue of relevance again and intangible. The other one that I want to talk about is really trust and how trust has actually become a strategic asset, right? That boards need to look at. And so we are operating in an environment, as we know, there is misinformation, there is polarization. We have increased scrutiny, we're living a social media world, information, all of those things. And they're actually, because of this access to information, which is so readily available, before you even leave a meeting, sometimes information is out there. There's a rising expectation around transparency and accountability, and that is not unreasonable. And so, of course, trust cannot be assumed. It has to be built, right? And so we know the effects of trust being lost. We know that advocacy, our effectiveness declines. We know that collaboration becomes more difficult once trust is lost. And for organizations like us, trust is arguably actually more valuable than some of the physical assets we have, because if our credibility is lost, then we have no voice with which to speak. So it requires a transparency. Our boards now require even more so now ethical leadership. It requires a stakeholder engagement. It requires clear accountability. And I heard on the previous panel talking about the organizational culture as well. And I believe Alasdair also referred to that. So these are actually strategic assets that need to be considered, and we need to govern accordingly. Right. One of the things that Alasdair spoke about, and I think this is particularly important, especially as he has said, as his family business has, changed and evolved over the years into our group, is the looking at time frame of centuries, is what he said. And if we're talking about, the title speaks to long-term value, and I believe that it is important to know that if we're talking about long-term value, it is about stewardship, right? So many of us in our day-to-day, we're so busy surviving. And so we're forced into a short-term thinking, right? Because there are pressing issues now. So there are the quarterly pressures, there are, political cycles, the economic shocks, which are today's business. But short-term success, of course, can undermine long-term sustainability. And of course, with that, we risk various things. He spoke about succession planning, for example. And in terms of, we're currently experiencing talent shortages. I don't know about you, but in Jamaica, one of the main issues being discussed nowadays is productivity, and in terms of employability and just the basic shortage of talent. There are leadership gaps. Of course, that brings the question of succession planning, that sort of thing. Weak institutional memory. And so some of these things are things that we need to consider, because boards are not necessarily just governing for today. We are supposed to govern as stewards of the future organization that we're leading. So governance must ensure that the institution remains relevant and impactful long after today's leaders have moved on, right? So this means protecting and growing our institutional credibility. It means our policy influence, leadership pipelines, some of the partnerships that we're able to develop. These are things that boards need to be focusing on. And so I just want to, commend those ideas to the rest of the panel for discussion. And that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Sacha. And of course, much of what you said resonated with me as also the leader of a volunteer association, where you have to deal with such things as, really having that institutional knowledge. When you have such opportunities for dynamic changes to your boards, how do you keep on that same trajectory? When you might see your boards change, when you might see the focus of the president change, the leadership change, it really puts a lot of onus on us as the secretariat to be able to guide those evolutions. So thank you so much, Sacha, for that intervention. And now, lastly, I'm going to ask Barry to make his introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Carmel, and thank you to the Governance Institute for the invitation to speak. It's greatly appreciated. And good afternoon to everyone. Let me start by echoing some of what was said by the last presenter, Sacha, and certainly, yeah, and certainly you yourself and Carmel would be in a similar position in terms of advocacy, which is an important part of governance, and a part of governance that I believe is becoming weaker across the Caribbean. And organizations like your organizations, I think, are the future in terms of governance, standards, and certainly preventing our institutions from falling onto the wrong side. Institutions like yours, I think, are needed more than ever now in this world that we live in. Institutions that advocate based on facts, knowledge, research, that have a non-partisan perspective. This is extremely important in a world that has become more and more partisan and more polarized. I believe that the advocacy organizations are the future of ensuring that governance standards are complied with, that governance is something, good governance, I should say, and transparency is something that continues to be a strong hallmark of Caribbean business. And certainly advocacy organizations, I believe, have to recognize just how important they are. And I commend you ladies for the work that you have done thus far. And I believe there's a lot more work to be done. We must protect our standards of in terms of governance and transparency, and good governance and transparency in the region. The topic that we are presenting here, I'm here representing Republic Bank, and risk and is something that is needed, but is feared. And from a bank perspective, certainly risk is measured. It is measured and then measured again and then measured again. It's not something that is taken lightly, but there are certain risks that this region will have to take in order to move it forward. We will have to get into new ventures. We will have to take areas of business and certainly reformat them to meet the changing world. And certainly risk is something that is needed, but in our small economies, we cannot afford to take risks which become detrimental to the society, because risk in a large economy is a different type of thing than risk in a small island, which then can affect so many different things and can really cause a domino effect. A lot of companies in the United States and other parts of the world, in fact, are built on taking huge risks, and they don't mind failure. They fail and they learn and they innovate from that failure. We have been a more risk-averse region where failure is not seen as a necessarily a part of your development, but may seem more as an indictment on your ability to do business, which we can argue both sides of the coin. But it is something that we have to look at, and certainly from a bank perspective, risk is something which is something that is an everyday and ever present scenario, but something that we have to watch and measure carefully. So there's a fine line between the risk needed to innovate and risk which will put that innovation in jeopardy put the business in jeopardy. And the other topic that we'll look at here is the long-term value creation, which really, to me, centers around something that boards do not spend enough time on, which is understanding their customers and certainly their audience, understanding the people. Sometimes I believe boards are very preoccupied with following board procedures and neglect cultural and social nuances, which would certainly impact the region in which they operate in. So all of these things, I believe, are an important part of this topic, and I look forward to discussing a little bit more in the question and answer segment. Thank you.
Thank you to, oh, sorry. Thank you to Barry, especially for bringing in that perspective. So we've gone from, a family-owned conglomerate. We've spoken from the perspective of a not-for-profit in essence, and now we're hearing from the banking sector, and really looking as well at the role of the CEO and leadership in terms of creating that long-term value creation. So thank each of you for bringing these perspectives to bear. And as I would have mentioned, we are now going to explore the topic in the Q&A discussion. So first, I'd like to ask each of you, what, in your personal opinion, is the main things that boards should remember when governing for long-term value creation? And I think, Sacha, you kind of touched on a number of these as you spoke about the fact the PSOJ is 50 years old. So I think you are in a prime position to start by answering this question.
Okay, thanks for that, Carmel. So yes, we are celebrating our 50th. In the larger scheme of things, it probably is not as long as, some of the other business support organizations that are there. However, I think what it has shown me, being the head at such a pivotal time and a milestone such as this, is the fact that long value creation really has to be seen through a long-term lens. And so how we are governing today, the foresight that is required and the responsibility that we have to that forward thinking, not just looking at today, but looking for the future. And I mentioned it earlier in terms of that stewardship that is required for future generations. It is about the sustainability of the organization another 50 years, another 100 years down the line. And some of those decisions that we may have to take are not necessarily based on our present conditions that are currently facing us. And so I think as a result of that, we certainly are making decisions about some of, the usual thing, the brick and mortar things, the tangible things, financial risk, all of those things. But again, it comes down to some of these softer intangibles that need to be looked at in terms of the credibility that we as organizations create for ourselves, the stakeholder management and engagement and the focus that is placed on that, because these things become very valuable and often are what we need to withstand the erosion of time. So that's my perspective.
Thank you, Sacha. And now Alasdair, with GA Roe being slightly older, the PSOJ, but perhaps coming from a perspective of a little bit more, I would say, direction from the top, I suspect, given the fact that it's a family business and perhaps you had set certain parameters, or your forefathers would have set those parameters from before. I would like to hear your perspective on this in terms of the main thing that your board perhaps has valued in terms of governing for long-term value creation, or that guides your board.
Thank you very much. Sacha, I mean, that's where the crossover is in our industries, right? It's you as a business support services company, you're looking at stakeholders, and so are we. I guess I'd answer it with a small and subtle difference, is that as a family-owned business, we're not publicly traded, we're privately owned. There is an expectation to grow. Some of the things that Mr. Riley talked about today, earnings growth, cash generation, those are some of the financial elements that we're looking for. we solidly understand our citizenship and the environments that we work in. And so we've got to be supportive of the broader stakeholder environment. So I think just to answer your question, yeah, from our board's perspective, and obviously we're involved in different businesses, but it's about understanding exactly who that ownership is, and you have to have a response there because that's the capital allocation that they're providing, and so you need to support that, but you also need to do it as a responsible citizen in your environment, and knowing Barry, you sit on a board of Republic Bank, those are some of the other citizens that you work together to be successful in these environments.
Okay, thank you, Alasdair. So Barry, over to you. So we've heard from Sacha and Alasdair looking at stakeholders and shareholders from very different perspectives, from a private company, from a not-for-profit, coming from the bank's perspective, which is very for-profit. What would you say, in your personal opinion, is the main thing that boards should remember when governing for long-term value creation?
I think that, thank you. I think that the bank's procedures are pretty much set, and there is limited flexibility with banking procedure. That's what creates a robust system. So from a bank perspective, value creation is something that is, from a board perspective, you are pretty much operating on procedures which have existed for years and maybe even decades. What is important is to continue to innovate. Innovate may be a strong word for a bank, but I should say refresh and relook at those procedures, and certainly bearing in mind your audience, your customers, which is key. A bank like Republic Bank, which operates in many different islands of the Caribbean and certainly has a presence on the continent of Africa, is a huge Caribbean organization in many different areas, and can be the temptation for a one-size-fits-all approach. There are some things which are governed by ECCB regulations and established banking policy, which certainly will have to stay. But I think if you are looking at long-term value creation, one of the things that we do is there's a lot of planning which takes place at the board level and at the senior management level, which ensures that the policies of the bank are relevant to the customers that you are serving on the particular island and in the particular region. So there's a continued refresh, there's a continued look. There's a lot of planning which takes place, organizational planning, customers, certainly succession planning is something that is key, because you want to ensure that you can continue to provide that service that you at that level. So all of these things are important. Ensuring that you stick to the established procedures, and ensuring that your procedures are nuanced enough to cater well to the particular audience and customers that you're serving, and then ensuring that you have enough, that your workforce is updated and planned enough, and that there's a forward plan for succession and so on, that you can continue to serve those customers that you have acquired.
Okay, thanks, Barry. And so that kind of leads me into a question for Alasdair. So, Alasdair, how do you think boards then should balance between risk management and growth and innovation?
Well, we got to move forward, and And so I think we have to move forward with our eyes wide open. Looking at and assessing risk is very important, and to do that collectively too. We operate in different, just in the insurance industry, we're insuring different types of risk, and therefore, in order to make that balance of looking at new risk and growing, you've got to assess the risk. And I think this is a role of management, and then it's something that the board needs to understand. One of the things that we've worked very hard to do, given the constraints of the individuals in all parts of our businesses, but to look at those that are on the board, they're non-executive, and therefore they have a limited role and to offer. And so, the elements, the executive elements within each company needs to look at these expansions of our business operations, needs to assess them. We love doing things in reports, so it's a written report, and it's something that can be assessed, discussed, possibly improved before it's enacted.
Okay, thank you. Okay, seems that Sacha has stepped away.
No, I'm right
there
here.
you are. Oh, good.
Right here.
So, Sacha, still on this, exploration of risk, from your perspective, do you think that Caribbean boards are generally too risk averse or not risk aware enough?
So I would hate to generalize. My experience is not as broad based as perhaps Barry or Alasdair in this particular context. But I think where we do have some cultural commonalities in terms of how we generally do business, I think it may be conjecture, but I think it is probably safe to say that across the board in the Caribbean, we're generally not as risk ready, or the appetite is not usually as high as in some other regions or more developed areas. And I think that is safe to say. And as a result of that, I believe that ability to take on innovation, and I think Barry referred to it earlier in terms of the need to balance, being in a new era, in a new time, and the ability to innovate and to manage risk at same time. And it is not a very easy dance for most to do. And so we also have to remember too that in organizations, maybe not for profits, but other organizations, there are stakeholders who, for them, value creation is also about, profitability and all of those things. However, we still do have a culture that is largely reticent as it relates to, innovation and risk. So I think that we find that generally boards are, more precautionary, as it were, as opposed to, forward thinking in terms of their risk management. That's what I would say.
Okay, thank you, Sacha. Looking at that, but perhaps from a slightly different perspective, Barry, but still focusing on Caribbean companies, do you think that Caribbean companies and boards spend enough time on long-term strategy, or are they too often focused on immediate challenges?
Thank you. The thing about it is that let's talk about risk first. Risk is something that, as I explained earlier, in the North American context, risk is a part of innovation, and failure is a part of the learning curve. The Caribbean is not as forgiving. Certainly, business people don't go bankrupt and then reinvent themselves. Bankruptcy and failure is used as a spotlight for people who can't do business. They say if you go bankrupt, they say, okay, maybe you try something else other than business. Whereas in the North American culture, it is said you get up and you try something else, so that then you have banks and other institutions doing business with the same people all the time. A man gets a loan and he's successful, and then the bank wants to lend him more money, and then you find the same families and same companies borrowing over and over from the bank, and it certainly narrows the maybe the types of businesses. It narrows innovation. It may stunt innovation, but it also protects the system, which is less able to withstand shocks. Let's say, for instance, if a bank lent a business several $1 million, and in a Caribbean context, and was not able to recover that, that would be a harder shock to a regional bank than a big international bank not able to recover those assets, especially in a region to where certainly new industries, there may be no examples of these industries, and you are between the bank and the person applying for the business. You may be the only person in that entire region, in that entire country, talking about that type of business, having any information on that type of business. And we've seen this in Grenada and across the Caribbean, the Eastern Caribbean. So risk is something that we need, but it is something that we have to be extremely careful with. And it also, whereas in the North American countries, Europe, you may be able to take an elevator to the top with risk. In the Caribbean, you have to climb the stairs slowly.
Okay, well, I mean, you sit as a director on a bank, and I know in the Caribbean we have lots of things to say about banks and them not being very risk friendly themselves. So,
you have to understand.
know,
I want to just jump in here just very quickly. A bank has to be extremely careful with risk because you are, I hear people say that all the time. And I say to them, I say, guys, we are not lending our money. We are lending other people's money. So we have to be very, very careful. And the thing about it is that the American banks are fail and then they get bailed out. The governments bail them out. I don't know if that can be the case here in the Caribbean.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think so either. But such is the situation. So I think as well that is probably, going back to the question that I was asking, if Caribbean companies spend enough time on long-term strategy and this whole idea of long-term value creation, or are they too focused on immediate challenges? I mean, among those immediate challenges are staying solvent, being able to grow, being able to find financing, and things like that. So it is really, I think, as part of this whole risk context, while you're trying to create that long-term value creation, extremely challenging. So on that note, it is, okay, a couple more questions. Sorry, Kamala, when I open up at the top of the hour, is that when you want to ask your question, or you wanted to ask it before we open to the floor?
Actually, I had wanted to follow up on the previous question you asked, Sacha, which is exactly what Barry just came in with, because that actually was a very unique point and a brilliant point that we really need to mull over for the region. We all talk about innovation. We talk about the need for us to be able to take risk. And from a textbook perspective, yes, failure is encouraged because that's how you know that you are trying things out of the box. But Barry is so absolutely right. You fail in the Caribbean, that's it. You don't get a second chance easily. And so we have to truly understand what risk taking means and how we engage in that in order that we satisfy what is our unique environment. So I was going to ask him to elaborate, and he went ahead and did it, already, because it's really such a critical point that we need to address.
Yes, of course. I mean, in the US, you have the whole concept of failing forward, and it's kind of understood that you use it as a learning experience. But here, a certain stigma is attached to you, and then you are not trusted again with, people's money, people's assets, the ability to manage. So all of that, I think, does us a disservice here in the Caribbean. That's very true. Okay, so now, Alasdair, being part of a family group, how do you think that boards could then strengthen risk culture across a group structure?
Well, I think I talked about centralized services before, and I think Barry, you bring up a really good point. This failed fast in the U.S. and maybe some of the structures around the savings in banks and the federal insurance dollars and things like that. We know just from our personal investments that making errors can be very expensive, and reputation is something that was discussed in one of the earlier panels. And given the familiarity across the region, obviously that impact on reputation is spread further. So Carmel, just to move it forward, because I think I love these conferences because there is this element of moving from the textbook to the application, and the practicality of that. Is a good example. This forum for this meeting is great because I think we represent 4 countries on this panel, which is magnificent because it's not cheap to get between. It's not cheap to travel between these countries. But Mr. Riley was absolutely right when he said you miss that local presence, that emotional, the body language that we all impart. So what I'm trying to get to is, you have to weigh and understand risk very closely, and I think we live in a very complex world. I mean, these failures, should they happen so much more quickly these days. And so you have to be very, very careful. And so, Carmel, just to take as an example, I'll give you 2 examples. One would be IT and technology. Obviously, that is moving at quite a pace. And I sort of run through very quickly on our insurance services side, the use of chatbots to reduce, to certainly speed up the communication and the triage of that communication to the right person to get them the solution that they need. But then to move that forward and to put in analytics on that frequency of communication to continuously improve that. It's something that we have to be very, very careful with. There's a great point that was made earlier about allowing employees to go out by themselves and utilize artificial intelligence themselves. And certainly a lot of the discussions I've been with in the last couple of weeks have suggested that just by paying, the $15 or $17, whatever it is, for the ChatGPT license gives you more protection. But nobody really understands how much protection that is because you quickly flip through the acceptance of that service, and it's a contract of adherence. You really don't have a chance to modify it. But so from technology, we know we've got to move for technology, and what that means to our workforce is that it allows them to hopefully operate at the highest level of their license, right? Elevate these people so they can truly bring a differentiator to their communication and involvement with whatever stakeholder they're dealing with. But we've got to look at it closely. And we have made mistakes where we've had administrative systems that haven't worked and we've had to back it out. And then we've had to commit thousands of work hours to put a new system in. These things happen, but you've got to continue to move forward. I think the other area is on culture and employees. We spent a lot of time talking about people and the fact that certainly regionally, I think the human resource management has not been appreciated maybe by a lot of staff. I know for our staff, we required everybody to do an annual appraisal and nobody liked it. I mean, we were looking at people who hadn't had an appraisal done for 4 years. And at that point, it's just it's a lost cause. So you have to engage, and you've got to look at better ways. Sacha, you were talking about 50 years. You look at decades, and you have to keep up. You continuously improve. So to bring it to a close, I mean, there's risk. It needs to be discussed. It needs to be assessed, and then it needs to be attacked and brought in. I think maybe the last thing to talk about is the regional regulatory powers, and I think those are big impediments to advances. Barry, we've spent years sometimes trying to get a bank account with certain banks in the region, but it's the AML, the anti-money laundering, the KYC, all those sort of things, those hoops that we have to jump through that just slows the acceptance and the adoption. Not to mention, I think too that just culturally, someone was telling a story the other day of they put an ATM in front of their business, not in Grenada, Barry, but they watched the ATM not be used for months before they could convince people to start using that, because they just wanted to go meet the teller inside, talk to them, find out how their day was, and do their business inside. So anyway, a lot of thoughts there for you, Carmel.
Thanks, Alasdair. Actually, that reminds me another discussion panel discussion I attended this morning here in Barbados, and one of the things that our Minister of Labour spoke about was the way in which the customer service of the bank seemed to drop dramatically when they installed the ATM machines, because they wanted to try to force you out of the bank to use the technology. So the long lines, etc., were just part of the strategy, apparently. But on the topic of moving, and you spoke a lot just now about, employees and getting employees to move. But there's a question in the chat from Kevin Bagaloo, and he's asking, what about when the leaders don't want to move on?
So, well, that was related to the fact that sometimes you have these challenges at middle management level as well, and how that impacts culture as well. But one of the things I wanted to ask Carmel, and just to raise, because we are talking about risk and we are talking about strategy, and if we look at the uniqueness of our region, I want to confess, when Robert was speaking earlier, and he was saying that he really does not like virtual meetings, especially for boards. My mind immediately went, well, my board is not going to meet otherwise, because, we have directors in Guyana and Barbados. As you know, Carmel, you join us for board meetings there from Jamaica. Brendan joins us from Canada. And therefore, for me, I see it as a huge opportunity for us to truly have a Caribbean base with a Caribbean board that's able to build a very unique space in the Caribbean that allows this platform for all of these voices. So, yes, there may be some disadvantages, and I guess it depends on the type of the organization, because certainly the risks we face are not the same as what will be faced by huge conglomerates that has a lot to lose. But finding opportunities in the risk. And that is something we have to think of as well, because whilst I agree with Barry 100% on the fact that you have to be risk averse because you don't want to fail. But within that, we have to also be creative enough to understand that with risk does bring some opportunities, and identifying those opportunities for unique value we could bring in today's world that would not have existed, let's say, 20 years ago. I think that's the challenge that is upon us now. And I think that challenge really begins in the boardroom. Because if it doesn't, it means for the most part, you would find most management continuing the way that practices have been set before. Because this was one of the things also raised at Governance Week so far. The fact that there was COVID, everything became disruptive. But then after COVID, people have been trying to force back into the way we were before. But you can't, because people have had the experience of COVID, the experience of stopping and looking at, does my life make sense? And also the experience of us, like I love virtual meetings, quite frankly, I'll confess. I'm very happy in the space. I'm comfortable. I feel very engaged with persons here. I've never met Alasdair in person, yet I feel I know Alasdair well, because we have had so many of these meetings where he would have spoken at, and so some of it requires us to also rethink what may be the opportunities that exist, because there are positive risks as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's what they usually say in terms of yin and yang, or the flip side of risk is opportunity. So that is true. To the point, and I don't know if Barry wants to respond as the banking representative, but is it time that people in the Caribbean also think outside the bank, because really and truly, I've heard banks say before that what you are trying to get them to do is adopt venture capital practices, or, you know, to be an angel investor, and that's not really their role. So is it time that those in the Caribbean, the companies, the small enterprises, I mean, we even have challenges here with our junior market in Barbados really taking off, and small companies really embracing that as a vehicle to get capital, to grow, etc. So I'm just wondering, in terms of the appetite for risk, maybe looking at it from both sides of that coin. Do you have any thoughts, Barry?
Firstly, let me just say that I do think risk is extremely important. In my own business, I'm not speaking of the bank, we take risk all the time. And it's because we take risks that we've grown. From a banking perspective, comparing North America to the Caribbean, the road of risk in North America and the Caribbean, in North America, the road of risk is a highway. In the Caribbean, the road of risk is a tightrope walk. So
Filled with potholes.
it sure is. We have to be the lending institutions and the governance institutions have to be extremely careful because of the size of our economy and its vulnerability to shocks. And you know, you've seen one or two projects that fail could impact an entire country, and that's not the case in bigger economies. In terms of specifically the question that you asked, should people start looking outside of the banks? I think that they should, and I think that the bank would welcome that, because, and I'll tell you why. Oftentimes people bring things to the bank when they're not ready to be, they're not bankable. So that project's brought to the bank and it's not bankable, and then you say, oh, it's not, oh, the bank didn't back me, so I'm done. No, it's just that you have not brought the project to the bank when it is ready for the bank. And I think that businesses have to look at, what can I do to make my project more bankable? Is it that I'm going to earmark, I'm going to get do a more collaborative approach with friends and family? Because this is what is done in the in what we call the developed world. Lots of people borrow money from family and friends, and they do a family round of investment, and they work on that, and then it is only then after that that it may take it to a bank or even a angel investor. So I think that there needs to be a lot more knowledge. There's nothing wrong with people looking at other means other than the bank, but because people have to understand what a bank is. A bank is not an investor. Largely, banks are not investors. So that we need to, in the Caribbean and as a whole, we need to have a more collaborative approach. A man will have an idea and he holds on to that idea until instead of sharing it and getting a group of people, like-minded people who could help him with the idea. And we prefer 100% of nothing in the Caribbean rather than 30% of something. And that's a big part of our problem. The lack of a collaborative approach, lack of understanding of what a bank is, and the lack of understanding of how businesses in the so-called developed world grow. They don't grow by just running to the bank. They grow by other stages before the bank. So some of that is our job too. I believe that banks have not done a good enough job in educating the public and really partnering with institutions like BIBA and CCGI in terms of we need to do a lot more entrepreneurship education in the region. I really believe that.
Thanks, Kevin. Sorry, thanks, Barry. Sorry, Kevin, who has his hand up. I'm not sure if that was in relation to your question in the chat that I posed, or if you still had wanted to ask another question. So I don't know if Kevin could be unmuted. Okay, Hi, Kevin. Did you want to expand on your question?
Yes, I did. One thing that stood out is when Mr. Collymore, he would have said that boards need to understand their customers and audience and so on. There, that is a very important thing. But also, I think it's safe to say that boards must first, some boards must first understand their roles, responsibilities, and the operations of their organizations in order to do that. But with regards to the discussion earlier about trust and culture, my question is this. Does corporate culture support transparency, fairness, and accountability? And are there any risks involved?
Well, we'd like corporate culture to support trust and accountability and all that. That's what I think most boards would want to see they have. But how do we know whether that's what the culture is supporting? I think that's a good question, and that's what Kevin is getting at as well. That how do directors know what is the culture of the organization and what that culture supports? So just to say, there's a little project at CCGI that we intend to bring on stream sometime in the future that would help organization measure this to know what it is their organization is saying, what is the culture of the organization. So the board has that direct information in order to know if they're setting the right tone and if they're governing effectively. So that's to come in the future. But that's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
Is your corporate culture one that is supporting transparency and accountability? Go ahead, Alasdair.
Yeah, I think it's essential, because you have to provide a safe environment for employees. I mean, that's fundamental. But I thought, there's some good points on how you have to trust but verify. The encouragement of visits by directors, I think, is very important. And then this whistleblowers policy, where you set up a clear policy on that protects an individual that is willing to to share some insider information, so that it can be acted on. I think those are some elements where you can verify that you are being responsible in this realm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm just looking at the chat. There's a comment from Derek Carmel. He says a healthy balance is required. I think that was in response to my saying we have our online meetings for our boards. He said, I can attest to the material value of in-person engagement to strengthen the online interaction. And I'm pretty sure that's true. We do meet once a year at least, and it certainly helps when you meet in person. But that is our exception to the rule. The majority of our meetings are online and we meet once a year.
Yeah, it's great to see Mr. Riley's on this session, but the continuity of the involvement of the directors too. And there's a question there from Kevin, what happened? What about when the leaders don't want to move on? And I think, we develop and learn in these programs. And I do think there needs to be assessments, regular assessments of the board, of their activities, of their effectiveness. I think that's something that we've been slow on, frankly, but it needs to be elevated. But in the practicality of things, right? You set a strategy, and Barry, the other thing about the region is it takes time. My cousin Andrew was talking about patience. And so it takes time for some of these projects and strategies to be developed. So there's this constant push and pull with that involvement of leadership and I suppose leadership we're talking about from a non-executive board level perspective, and then the tactical application of that strategy. So I think, and just to talk about leaders too, my reference below earlier about the broader time horizons that we should be looking at, and just to stick up for some of my grayer-haired colleagues on the board who still insist on paper packages that are like this thick, and as Liz said, they never get through them. But but they, the response of the individuals on the board and their ability to ask the right questions, right? I'm always amazed to find the individuals who get us to look around the corner to see, what are we missing? And I think that comes from a level of sophistication. They're not going to be the first ones to use Zoom. They'll be the last ones if they ever use Zoom. But their ability with a broader context to what we're looking at today, in our decades, 2, 3, 4 decades, they give us a much broader and maybe a more patient perspective too, that we have to engage with, we have to respond to and satisfy before you move forward to try and eliminate these costly risks that every business will make.
Mhm, mhm. And as we have Robert Riley with us, maybe we can ask if he wants to unmute and join the discussion as well, to elaborate a little bit in his support for Barry's point about the need for more education and mentoring to help. So Robert, if you're able to unmute and join us.
Yeah,
We have 15 more
I've been just it's really lovely just to be a a fly on the wall, so to speak, and just listen to some wise thoughts. I don't know where to jump in, but a lot has been said. I think education, mentorship, commercial thinking, as opposed to what I call accounting, knowing the numbers, but really having the numbers speak. I think are all opportunities in the Caribbean, and a part of helping us to make lengthen our strides on strategy and direction, and also the management, mitigation, the acceptance of certain levels of risk that will allow us to move forward. I think at the heart of that, though, is high quality, well trained, well developed people. It's the thing that remains with me. The older I get now, is how much it matters, the quality of the people that you work with and have around you, to make a difference, to take on challenges. I'm not. I also say I'm not 100% in the camp that says we are risk adverse.
I was going to
I
ask your
know
comments
I know
on
we
that.
have in a sense, a larger social consequence of risk failure. I think it's why I sort of just promulgated today the idea of thinking about your business in a number of horizons. And one size doesn't fit all for managing risk or opportunity in each of those horizons. If you're dealing with a settled, mature business, the kinds of risks there are very different, and the way you manage them very different. So if you say trying, as Alasdair, I was listening very carefully to your the sense of your journey with IT solutions, AI, these things are coming so fast, and the evolution is increasingly, and you have to participate. You just know that you have to. Um, um, how you take that on is very different to how you might take on the management of a series of stores that have been going for a while, and you're trying to optimize them. You have settled and experienced staff in that domain, and your customer base is strong. Very, very different ways you'd manage that versus say. And then the only thing I haven't heard you all speak to is, I'd love to hear a little bit about, yes, when you fail a failure, you can turn failure into positive, because at BP we used to say, well, I certainly learned that in the mantra of safety. Every incident had a lot of consequence. And the only way you could get value out of that kind of loss is to learn. So to extract as much learning, so that some of the simple mistakes you made during that occurrence, you don't have to make them again. So the learning organization, the part of the organization that is not just curious, but is actually then taking mistake as an opportunity to learn. And I think that's the part of risk management that sometimes we don't get into what I call the real root causes. not the immediate sort of things, but the real root causes. Why did that occur? Why did we fail? Sometimes it's out of your hands. We know that. But oftentimes there's a lot that you can learn about the way you approached it to manage the risk better. Don't know if that helps. And Kamala, I was not saying you shouldn't meet online. I love them too. I love the meetings. Look at what I'm able to participate with you all today.
Yes.
And I'm sitting here at home in London, right? So it's important. But my reflection from a few years now on boards is that it really does, and there are techniques. I've seen a very big gold business, and their board meets a lot of times online, but 4 times a year they spend 3 days together each. And these guys are busy guys, busy guys and ladies. They're from all parts of the world. And they come together and they spend that concentrated time just thinking about this business with the management. And it's made such a big difference. So there's a place for each one.
Yeah.
And I think we can't let COVID, it's just maybe do a little bit of the age. You can see it, the gray. Speaking now, human interaction really can make a big difference. So don't lose it.
Yes, yes, accept that. And actually, what I was thinking too, Robert, was when you think of the level of risk averseness that people may have, really, I think in the region is related to how strong your network is. If you have a good, strong network, then normally you are a little more likely to take risks because there are people who will catch you. They will have your back and you may be able to get back up quickly. So, and relationships are very important to us in the region. So it's interrelated. I agree.
I worked in the oil industry where there's a lot of Texas sayings, and one of the sayings in Texas is, "If you beat a puppy, don't expect it to be a brave dog." And I think they use some rougher words than that. And I think as boards and as very senior management, when people feel the fundamental attribution error is to blame the human. And I think before we go there, we should really be asking the question, what could we all learn from this failure? Sometimes it's a human, right? But not a lot, not all the time. And if you look it up in the literature, there's something called, as humans, we have something called, once something is a little complex, we tend to look for the humans to blame first. It's called fundamental attribution error. You see it a lot in the safety literature. We used to beat the nearest person to the incident in safety before asking the question, what really was the root cause of this failure? And I think it can be applied in business as well. Too many times people fail and we beat them rather than learn.
It's interesting to hear you use it in the safety context because, in fact, I know of that concept in leadership where the fundamental attribution error means that we don't look at ourselves at fault when we make mistakes, but let someone else make a mistake and you immediately find fault in them, and that is how I understood the fundamental attribution error to exist in the leadership context. So yes.
It's there in neuroscience. It's just a human, it's a normal human trait that you have to train yourself not to go to that instinct first.
Yes, agreed. Carmel, we have just about 5 more minutes remaining for this panel discussion. I think it's just been really, really very good and wide-ranging. So maybe you want to ask your panelists to...
Yes, I do have a final question for the panelists. So as Kamala has noted, although let me just ask, Sacha, you've been a bit quiet through the discussions. Is there anything that you would like to offer an intervention on before we get to that last question? Oh, you're muted. Okay. I don't know, Quentrell, if you could unmute. Oh, there we go. No, wait, you're muted again.
Sorry, I had an external screen, and so the cursor was not
Oh,
going
okay.
to
Okay,
unmute.
okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Technology.
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
please go ahead, Carmel.
No, I was just only asking before I went to that overall general question that I'd shared with everybody, if there was anything in the discussion that had been happening that you had felt you wanted to offer any thoughts on.
So I'm captivated by is it Mr. Riley?
Yeah,
Robert Riley's what
yeah.
he was saying in terms of the whole culture of blame and everything. And I believe that and even what he shared, I'd never heard it before in terms of the fundamental attribution error. Because for me, some of the issues that I think we face as Caribbean organizations is really a question of leadership. And I think Kamla referred to it earlier in terms of the introspection that needs to happen in terms of us as leaders. And so I believe that there is a huge deficit. So we have great leaders in some respects, but I think in terms of, and it also comes back to the succession planning that somebody also referred to in terms of what do you do when the present leaders don't want to go. And so I believe that that is something that we really need to look at. And I believe that the blame culture, the risk of innovation because of not wanting to fail and all of those things become a question of maturity of leadership of our organizations. And I believe that if we are to advance in terms of our economic growth as a microcosm in terms of organizations themselves and in the wider economy, those are things that we have to look at in terms of the leadership, the mindset, and it really begins with that. And I started my discussion talking about trust, trust for an organization in terms of its stakeholders, in my case, for example, our members, 400 and odd businesses. But there's also a huge trust deficit that exists in the wider society, and it's not just vis-a-vis governments, for example. It is also organizations and organizational leadership. And that trust gap is a reason that I think it has stymied so much progress. And I think I can safely say Jamaica, as much as Barbados, as Trinidad, all over the region. And that trust deficit is something that continues to hold us back. And I think it is something that all boards need to be looking at, that as it's not something that you can see under the microscope. It's not something that's necessarily tangible in terms of a dollar value or figure. But I believe that it is such an important consideration that we all need to be looking at that trust factor. So that's just my 2 cents on that.
Okay, thank you, Sacha. So just to wrap up, because bring it back home to the whole concept of long-term value creation, I wanted to ask each of you to say from your perspective, what measures a company can look at? How can a company really measure that what they're doing is creating, or what can indicate that what they're doing is creating long-term value creation? So we've talked about a number of things in terms of risk and leadership and innovation and etc. But fundamentally, what we're trying to get at is for the long term, not in the immediate with everything that we're grappling with now. How do you as a company know that you are creating that long-term value creation, or what measures are you putting in place to determine if you're creating that? So I will start with Barry. What are your thoughts?
I'd get out my crystal ball and look into it.
Okay, seriously, Barry, you have your hotel. You know that you want longevity of this
No,
hotel. So, yes,
no, long-term value creation in this
yes.
current world is a difficult thing to measure because we are experiencing change now faster than any other generation has experienced it. And the things that we are guessing, because that's what we do educated guesses on right now. We don't know if they're in fact. But one of the things I think that you can look at is customer retention, and repeat customers and customer retention. If you are retaining your customers, you talk about growth is always good as well. But if you are retaining your customers and you have high customer satisfaction, I think that's a good indicator that you are heading in the right direction. But also one of the things that you could do is to make sure that that your board is comprised of members who are of the people. So that the board is comprised of persons who have either local business people or local people with local knowledge. And certainly you have a way of everyday way of encouraging and managing customer feedback. That, along with investing in your staff. For instance, if your staff is not you AI coming on and other things, if your team members are not well versed in that, then you're putting yourself out of business. But the crystal ball is still the best option.
Thank you, Barry. So Sacha, I mean, so we've talked about, or Barry talked about customer retention. I think for us and member-based associations, avoiding that churn is also very key. But any other thoughts in terms of what other measures indicate long-term value creation?
I believe that, yes, within the context of a BSO and all of those things, but I think generally, I think those who are going to survive long term, whether it is not for profit, BSO or otherwise, is where there is foresight, where there is a sort of adaptability mindset, because right now it is about organizational resilience. How resilient are you in terms of your structures, in terms of the changes that are emerging around us? Barry just spoke about the AI and all of those things. There's a geopolitical uncertainty, all of those things. And if we are not forecasting, and again, we don't have the crystal ball, but we are supposed to at least try to make some educated guesses. But a lot of us are fixing what's happening today, or even fixing for a past model or an organization that these are issues in the past. We need to be forecasting. We need to be fixing for tomorrow. We need to be fixing for next year. And as I said, not a crystal ball, but educated guesses, and a strategic approach that is nimble, more agile, and future forward and future looking. So resilience is going to be the key, and I think that is where a board capacity must be. And I think the best boards are going to be those who are not talking about just hindsight. It really is a foresight. And it's also not just oversight. We moved long ago from that compliance discussion. It really is a forward thinking and foresight that is required. So.
Okay, thank you, Sacha. And in the last few moments, Alasdair, your thoughts on the whole idea of measuring for long-term value creation? What can companies look for?
Yeah, great.
Or identify?
Yeah, sure. To build on Barry and Sacha. So we talked about risk and strategy today, and I think many people might be fearful of doing anything, right? The consequences are such in the Caribbean. But Sacha, you were very clear about the need for collaboration. We talked about transparency that entered our discussions. And so as we look at that crystal ball, because I mean, all these are good answers, you have various ways to measure value creation. Sitting here looking at 250 years of advancement in the United States, it just so happens that during that time, the life expectancy of people has doubled to 79